And okay, everyone, we're being recorded. So I'm in Chicago. We've got this circus going on. Even the clowns don't have anything to do here. The decisions that the delegates are supposed to make have all been made by parties unknown and through a process not seen, I was going to say never seen before, but we didn't see it this time either. And all we know is that suddenly Camilla Harris, who's never had one person really vote for her for president, is the Democratic presidential nominee. And this is the government that lectures the world about democracy. And I assume the very next president of the United States will continue that tradition. What's it look like from where you guys are?
Don, I'm wondering if we're going to see your camera on.
Oh, okay. Well, you can, but I'm not really in a good location for this.
Oh, you just wanted us to have our cameras
Yeah,
on.
yeah. I'm going to use this as in a piece where I spoke with you guys. They're going to see the back of my head in the studio.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Okay, see my green screen back there, and my bed's over here. And
Yeah.
here we go. So let me get out of this shot. Okay. All right. So anyway, whoever wants to take that on first. I mean, we're looking at a couple of different comparative models: Venezuela, Nicaragua, Washington, Ukraine, Gaza. I don't know.
Do you want to talk about Venezuela, Camilla?
Yeah. Well, how should we start it out then?
Well, this is, we've had Joe Biden. He didn't have to go through a primary process and convention last year either, as you may recall, because of COVID, supposedly. The rules were suspended in a number of states to outlaw the primaries as public health hazards. And he managed to win whatever system was put in place in all of those places, and that lifted him. The convention itself, which is where the delegates are supposed to go and physically vote, and they have some free will, even on the first ballot, for who they think the candidate should be. And that convention never took place. Again, COVID. Instead, they crafted together this 3.5 day long public access TV show. It was kind of like Wayne's World meets, the Democratic National Convention. And out of that came Joe Biden and Camilla Harris and the last 4 years worth of policy, including all of the attempted coups and successful coups in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Okay.
So that's where this starts. So, you look at it from Venezuela. I mean, how does the word legitimacy fit in here? They've been saying that Maduro is not legitimate, but when he's challenging a coup, the people stand with him.
Okay, so should we start? Or are you?
Yeah. I'm just saying, somewhere in there, yeah.
Well, over the course of the last few years in which Joe Biden has been president, we've been hearing all of these denouncements from Donald Trump and his supporters and other Republicans about the electoral system in the United States. It seems that they believe that it isn't a clean and fair election, that a lot of things happened during the last presidential election there in the United States. We also hear that there was specific political persecution against Joe Biden's opponent, Donald Trump, and that those people who stormed the US Congress a few years ago have been unfairly prosecuted on political grounds, that this is a country, the United States, that has political prisoners. And that's really interesting because in the case of Venezuela, since long before the election, the so-called international community, which is really just a collection of the United States, Europe, and some of its close allies, have been following very closely what happens in Venezuela, and they've been denouncing the process as unfair. They have been saying that Venezuela's government would never allow any other, first of all, competitors to take part in the elections, and a lot of different claims. None of those claims have been made by this same group of countries that call themselves the international community when it comes to the United States, despite that so many people in the United States have said that this election process is slanted against Donald Trump. So it's really interesting here because for the last 3 weeks, it seems as if whatever is taking place in Venezuela, and of course I just got back from there recently, has taken hold of the international news headlines. People are absolutely obsessed with talking about Venezuela, calling it a dictatorship, calling this government authoritarian. But having spoken to so many international election observers who traveled to Venezuela to witness the process before and during the elections, they say that it's a very different, very distinct process from what we see in the United States, and that in a lot of ways it's more secure, a lot stronger, more transparent, and it just makes more sense.
You know, what's funny, a lot of the critiques that we're seeing now include nested within them this accusation, basically, it's presented as an accusation that the arbiter of the election process, you know, those who make determinations as to whether or not these things were valid and these things were compliant and these things were government controlled agencies, as if the administration of an election in a country should be administered by someone other than the government of that country. I'm not aware of any place where that's done. It sure as hell isn't done in the United States.
And I think Stephen has said this before. It's absolutely unprecedented. In every country of the world, you would think, with the exception of countries that are absolute colonies or protectorates or in total control by the United States or some other power, it is the institutions of the country, not the government, but the institutions of the country, whether it be the Electoral Board or the Supreme Court or the Supreme Electoral Tribunal that organizes and looks after the elections. They're tasked under their constitutions, especially in the case of Venezuela, to carry out the electoral process. They have an entire electoral chronogram or schedule, a timetable for when things have to take place, years before the actual vote takes place and after the election takes place. And those are the things that the authorities and all of the state institutions have to abide by. There's no really going off script on that. And in the US, there's no such electoral board. So it's quite bizarre. But then in the case of Venezuela, it seems that all of these other countries, and in the case of the OAS and international organization, believe that they're the ones, the European Union as well, believe that they're the ones who are going to have the final say on the election in Venezuela. It's just not legitimate enough until they declare who the winner is supposed to be. They've already declared their winner, and they say that the opposition there received the largest amount of votes. It's really interesting and peculiar, because how is it that they're able to know that the opposition won the larger number of votes if they don't have access to the servers of the National Electoral Council in Venezuela? Where are they getting their numbers from if they don't have access to that, unless they themselves sent an observer to the country to download the database?
Or if they have control of the internet system sufficiently that they didn't have to send anybody, they just whipped it off the devices.
Yeah, and it's interesting you should say that, because the Venezuelan electoral digital system is completely separate from the internet.
That's right.
Which is very different to the United States, where, as I understand it, voting machines in states where they use computerized voting machines or some similar digital system are in fact connected to the internet and wide open to the extremely smart hacking capabilities that have become so obvious in so many different contexts around the world. So, but going back to what Camila was saying about the institutional aspect, and in many countries, in fact, I think in practically all Latin American countries, the electoral body is counted as a fourth power to the state. So you have
State, yeah.
the executive power, the judicial power, the legislative power, and you have the electoral power. And so they are a completely independent arm of the state, and each country's constitution sets out how that electoral body, how the composition of that electoral body is to be carried out. And so, as I understand, I hope Camila will correct me, but as I understand it, the electoral body in Venezuela does have representatives of opposition political parties on it. That's certainly the case here in Nicaragua. And I think there are one or two representatives of opposition parties on the electoral board, because here in Nicaragua, that's based on the electoral makeup of the legislature. So, and normally the electoral body here in Nicaragua reflects the composition, the political composition of the legislature. But again, I'm here in Nicaragua, and I remember our dear friend Fiorella Isabel, who works for RT. She was here with our friend also, Craig Jardula, pastor.
Yeah.
And when they were here in Nicaragua following the elections in 2021, they were extremely impressed by the transparency of it all, because in each electoral kind of junta, in each polling station, there were present representatives of all the opposition political parties who were there when the polling station opened. They stayed there all during the day of the voting process, and they were present when the final tally of votes was made in that polling station. And they all got a copy of the number of votes that were cast for each respective party. And a copy of that final total was posted outside the polling station so that everybody could see what the result was at that polling station. And so then all those votes, I'm sure it's very similar in Venezuela, although they have a digital system. And the votes from the local polling stations are then sent to the municipality, the municipal electoral body. And then from the electoral municipal body, the physical votes I'm talking about are then taken to the departmental and then to the national voting center, where they're kept available if it's necessary to do a recount, a physical recount.
Right.
And the results, the final results from the tallies are communicated digitally to the electoral council, who then tot them all up. I'm sure it's very similar in Venezuela, but I don't think that that's the case at all in the United States. As I understand it, there's not, correct me if I'm wrong, Don, but as I understand it, at the polling stations, there's not necessarily any statutory representation on the part of opposition parties. They don't get to total the vote. They don't get to witness that count. Am I right about that?
Yeah, here's in the United States, the law. First of all, you have 50 states and then 6 or 7 territories, and the way the constitutional system was written, these things are to be conducted by the states with certain federal, some aspects of it are controlled by the Constitution, but the bulk of it is at the discretion of the states. You've had states that didn't allow election of senators directly, for example, until fairly recently in the country's history. They were chosen by electors or by the state legislature or by appointment by the governor and things like that. You also have, though, permeating the whole like federal structure and then the state structure is replicated almost the same style. Boards of elections, state and county level, and in some cities like New York, municipal level, where there's 2 commissioners, and the law is written that enables this to representatives of the 2 highest vote-getting parties. But in essence, you have a Republican commissioner and a Democratic commissioner, and then a Republican deputy commissioner and a Democratic deputy commissioner. And what they are charged with doing is handling the physical aspects of the election, preparing ballots, deploying machines and personnel to administer the voting, to the count, all of that, even going back to who gets on the ballot, that the whole preliminary aspect of it. The petitions to get on the ballot, you go out and get signatures here from people that are members of the party that you would like to be the representative of a particular office. You have to get something like 5% of the signatures of the members of the party in that jurisdiction that the office covers. And unless the commissioners or the party officials, who are very often the same people, decide we're going to have Bob or Mary or Sue run, and then they can just appoint them. You can challenge them in a primary by getting a large number of signatures that have to be filled out just so. And when they're submitted, generally the Board of Elections finds that they have not been prepared just so. And then you have 3 days to prepare a case in a state court and serve it, and with particulars of, say, 1,100 signatures, where I got Bob Smith, 100 Main Street, Austin, New York. I submit that signature, says he's a registered Democrat. The guy who's challenging me says no such person at that address. Now I have to get acceptable evidence of all of this, submit it to the Board of Elections within 3 days of their findings. And I may not find out about their findings until 5 days after they've reached them, if they want to play games. And then prepare legal documents for, like I said, 1,000, 1,500 of these to get me back enough of the signatures that were knocked off to be on the ballot. Then I go into court, and the judge that's there, isn't that the guy that was at the train station collecting signatures with the guy I'm running against last Friday? That's how the system works in the United States, replicated from the municipal level to the county level to the state level. I learned something else too, though, because what you were talking about. When I went to Russia, as you guys know, in March to be an election observer in the presidential election there, and they sent me out to Krasnoyarsk, and I'm glad they did, because I was focused more on my job than on being in Russia and seeing my friends and stuff. And so I got to dig into the process there somewhat. First of all I witnessed or observed was the administration of the vote on election day. There were 3 days election day. The opening of the polls, what goes on at the polls during the day, close, what goes on overnight, from the time they open till the time they close Saturday morning or Friday morning to Monday morning. I was kind of not surprised, but the place looked very much like the polling places do where I live in Austin, New York. Firehouses, schools, post office, things like that. And although the people seem more involved, like the community seem more involved than they are where I am. For example, the voting goes on in the schools where I am, but they closed the schools that day. Here, the children are outside singing to the voters and bringing them cupcakes and whatever. They're more involved in the administration of the thing. You go in, there's a table with people sitting there. They look up your name. If you're in there and you can prove that you're you, they give you a ballot to take and fill out behind a little curtain with a pencil or whatever. You come out, they stuff that ballot in a machine that scans it and then drops it into the bin in the bottom. They do a calculus of the vote by machine count at the end of the day, I think, or at the end of the 3 days. I don't remember which. And then they preserve, however, the ballots as they are in the machine under seal, and they refer to those for audit purposes. If there's a discrepancy, a challenge, or whatever, is preserved there. From the time that they bring the machines they deploy the machines to the site, they are under a 24/7 video surveillance, open source. Like you can look them up too and watch them on the internet and make sure, Boss Tweed isn't climbing in there with a truckload of ballots or whatever. Then they do a count like they do in Nicaragua and Venezuela, and in New York somewhat, in front of everybody. But if I'm not, like, I've been an independent candidate 4 or 5 times, getting knocked off the ballot frequently, for example. And I want to sit here while you count the votes. No, you don't have a seat. The Republican has a seat and the Democrat has a seat. And so that's the system here.
Right. Yeah, and I should mention that in Nicaragua, it's all hand counted. There are paper ballots. There's no digital element at all. And a lot of people think that that's much more. It's much more transparent and trustworthy than any digital system. Although the Venezuelan system seems to have multiple safeguards that make it practically invulnerable to tampering.
Yeah. Well, when you're talking about power, okay, these are the levers of power, no matter where you are. Human beings can be very creative at evading safeguards and again, laying their hands on that raw energy.
Right.
It's exactly the wrong people are attracted by it.
Right.
Like what happened in Bolivia this past year, and what happened with Zelaya a few years back, and what happened with yeah, I mean that kind of thing also. How come? I mean, apply that logic that was used against any of those people, Mel Zelaya or Evo Morales, or even Korea walking away after term limits. Look at Joe Biden.
Yeah, I don't think we even have to go to extremely controversial cases of electoral of where there was obviously electoral skullduggery, like there was in Honduras, right?
Yeah.
For the re-election of Juan Orlando Hernandez, and if you look at the electoral processes that have taken place in places like Mexico or Guatemala, even this last vote in which Claudia Sheinbaum won an absolutely unprecedented, incredible victory with well, what was it? Almost 80% of the vote. I've forgotten how much it was. It was a ridiculously steamroll. She won by a mile. But even in that case, the opposition candidate, I think her name was Xochitl Galvez, registered a protest, and that was duly dealt with through the relevant process. And so, it's not that there has to be, an extreme controversy for an election to involve recounts. And the same happened. Something similar happened in Guatemala, in the last election in Guatemala. And in any election, people are going to say, well, we feel that we've been hard done by, and we should have got more deputies in the legislature or whatever it may be. And there's a process to deal with that. And there is that process exists in Venezuela. And what Nicolas Maduro has done in Venezuela, and perhaps Camila can fill us in as to how far that process has now advanced, was that he exercised his right to ask the electoral chamber, the Sala Electoral of the country's Supreme Court, to verify what the results was and to look at the whole electoral process and come to a decision about its integrity and whether its integrity was affected in some way. And perhaps Camilla is more up to date with that process than I am.
Well, one important element that I don't think we've mentioned this time around, but we might have in a prior discussion, was that Venezuela's government had denounced internationally that their electoral system, the CNE that is, was the victim of some cyber attacks during the election day and afterwards, as have at least 25 state institutions. And that's something very specific because, other countries don't have to withstand all of these attacks during their processes, although there might be cyber attacks on their election. The opposition and all of their influencers and their networks of people who are working with them, among them US lawmakers, sitting congressmen, and people like Elon Musk, have made it very clear that they are wanting to out the government and President Nicolas Maduro from power. But online, they have been talking about committing acts of cyber terrorism and targeting government and state institutions. They're saying that publicly at the same time as the government has been denouncing it. So there should be no question in anyone's mind what it is that they're doing. So it makes things a lot more difficult. At the same time, they're trying to crash official government and institutional websites where people get information. And they're also, making all of these threats and political statements online. And it's, of course, Elon Musk who Trump said in a recent interview that he would consider giving a cabinet position to him. And he's someone who now owns one of the largest online platforms. And so, these are kind of the circumstances that Venezuela is facing as they try to sort out, this process following the elections. And as we await what happens next from the Supreme Court, is that the institutions are under attack. And it doesn't seem like anyone in this so-called international community of allies of the United States, Europe, and Canada, and Luis Almagro seem to have any issue with that. They have already decided who the victor is, and they're just looking for a way to install them. And that's at the same time as these, we have people such as Eric Prince, who is the founder of Blackwater, and other mercenaries and other former Marines that work for private military contractors are also getting involved and putting out statements saying that they want to help liberate Venezuela. It's a very peculiar time.
Yeah, and the other thing that and Don, you obviously know far more about this than we do, but the other thing that's so perverse in the United States electoral process are these weird accusations, these bizarre accusations, completely unfounded. For example, that the whole Russiagate phenomenon, where the Democrats accused Donald Trump of being the beneficiary of intervention by President Vladimir Putin of Russia against the Democrat Party, when they themselves were the people that were responsible for the material that was their skullduggery, their bad faith was revealed by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, right? Am I right in that? And then now you've got this ridiculous, totally bizarre claim that Iran is somehow intervening.
I know. Look, I mean, I remember the Green Revolution, so-called. Remember that? Iran, Iran had an election by which Mossadegh became prime minister, and then suddenly he wasn't. How did that happen?
Right.
That's 70 years ago now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Iran has recently had a very successful election where the candidate that people least expected to win came out on top.
Yep. After a very traumatic assassination.
Right, exactly. Yep. So yeah, and so there's that aspect to the US election process whereby they make these absurd claims of other countries intervening when they themselves, in fact, carry out grossly overt intervention in favor of the opposition candidate in countries like Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that you have here in Nicaragua, for example, was that the United States intervened there, trying to tell the Nicaraguan Electoral Authority who should be allowed to be a candidate and who should not prior to the 2021 elections. Yep. There was 6 people who were being, I think, in fact, all of them subsequently were found to be in the pay of the United States one way or another.
Right.
Who claimed that they were presidential candidates, but who weren't even members of any political party, let alone completing the process to be recognized as a legitimate presidential candidate. The United States and the European Union were trying to tell the Nicaraguan authorities that these people had to be allowed to take part in the election. You know, and it's just extraordinary, the double standards that Camila has been talking about as well.
Impunity means never having to say you're sorry.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and in terms of the electoral, you at the beginning you were talking about how candidates are chosen and this extreme strange anti-democratic process, which struck me as somewhat similar to the way the Chinese Communist Party operates in choosing its candidates, except that they're probably much more democratic than in the United States, where a tiny elite decides who the candidate is. Whereas in the Chinese Communist Party, you have something like 80 million people who take part in that whole long drawn out process of deciding who should be a candidate at any given level. Very somewhat similar to the system in Cuba.
Yep.
But here in Nicaragua, that we have a somewhat similar internal party process to the Chinese Communist Party or the Communist Party of Cuba, whereby within the FSLN, people at grassroots, they reach a consensus, and that consensus then becomes the official party position. Yeah. So, and very early on in the process, there'll be people who may be put forward as candidates, but by the time a consensus is reached, that all that gets left behind, and there's just the party position. So at any party congress, and there's practically unanimous support for Daniel Ortega, you know, as the presidential candidate. Yep. And then as you go down to the discussions about who should be the candidate for a deputy in the National Assembly, or who should be a candidate as a municipal council, or that those different levels, then there are internal party discussions around that. They reach a consensus, and that becomes the party position. So right. It seems to me that that's much more democratic than the process whereby Kamala Harris was anointed by the extremely wealthy elite that runs the Democrat Party. And then she was presented as a fait accompli without any discussion among the grassroots.
It's even cuter in context. After this circus ends every night, there's 12 hours of, in essence, commercial advertising for Camila Harris campaign in the form of newscasts, editorial discussion, and all of this. It's like hardcore campaigning.
It's hardcore propaganda.
Yeah. Really
bizarre. And despite that this isn't a process that's done at the grassroots or with participation of real breathing human beings that are verifiably human, when this is all done in just over 2 months, and the vote is done, and we know the election results, I don't think that there's going to be anyone internationally who disagrees with the outcome of the election, whether one candidate wins or the other, and for however long it takes for the results to be announced and whatever spat may come afterwards. People will just have to, or leaders around the world will just have to accept whatever the result is, and they're not going to get involved. That's a starkly different situation from what we're experiencing in Venezuela. What we're seeing with regards to Venezuela is all of these statements coming out, all of these positions being taken, and in fact, in countries like the United States, it's an entire component of their election platforms. It's that they're threatening to be to have a better position on Venezuela and trying to use that issue to squeeze out a couple more votes while also threatening the governments of other countries. And that's how they pander to a certain base within the country. So that's really, it's really remarkable, because what you'll see once we get in the final tally in the United States is that all of these countries, China, countries of Latin America, are going to issue a statement of congratulations to the winner and the president-elect, and they won't be questioning the process.
Yeah, and another aspect that maybe perhaps worth mentioning is the whole issue of the phony political pluralism that the United States claims to exemplify.
Yeah.
And for example, and it makes no difference who wins the election, certainly in foreign policy terms, in the United States, and I suspect it perhaps even more so in terms of financial policy, because who determines U.S. financial policy? Well, the elite Wall Street financial clique, those huge multinational financial behemoths like BlackRock and so on.
Right. Vanguard.
So they're the ones that decide United States monetary and financial policy, and Congress is a joke in that regard. And likewise, as regards foreign policy, Congress is practically irrelevant in that regard. You know, and so what you know, we're just back to that old saw of two parties, two wings of one political party, and from my own interpretation of that whole situation is that the United States has been essentially the union of corporate and political power, which is the classic definition of fascism, for many, many years now. And so that's what flavor of fascism will people vote for this year is the only question, you know? And so, and when you compare that with politics in countries like Venezuela or Nicaragua or many other Latin American and Caribbean countries, there is a genuine choice. There would be very, very different consequences in Venezuela were in the extremely unlikely event the Venezuelan opposition could unite enough to together enough popular support to win there, and there would be a complete change of policy in Venezuela, and we can see examples of that in Argentina with the victory of Javier Milei over the previous Social Democrat administration there. At least whatever the faults of that Social Democrat administration under was it Alberto Fernandez were, they at least tried to do things to protect the majority of the population from the economic effects that they inherited from Macri, who indebted the country to the tune of, I've forgotten how many tens of billions it was, 50 billion, was it? Something like that. And now, now Milei's, and the difference between them and Milei is extremely sharp. You know, and in terms of 55% poverty, people actually in poverty in Argentina now, 55%. People on the verge of poverty are something like 15%. So you have people you've got 70% of people practically in poverty and in extreme poverty in Argentina, which is a member country of the G20. Right. Can you imagine?
Yeah, that's right. It's practically a first world country. Camila, you've lived around the area there for a while. I assume each of these countries has, their own characteristics to go with some of the more common, problems with the elections and such. Have you seen any things that look like interesting, flourishes or local customs or something to deal with this stuff?
Local customs in Venezuela?
Oh yeah, or wherever around there. Is any, they're all trying to push off the United States in one way or another, even where they collaborate. And I assume that people have different ways of like facing these conflicting, the contradictions that they face. Maybe some of them are interesting.
I'm not sure I know what you're getting at.
Yeah, me neither, really. Uh, I mean, there are, how many countries are there in South America? Like a lot. Okay, 12, something like that. And each of them, each has its own unique government. Um, they exist in a common space, and there's a common historical relationship, although maybe varied inter alia, but with the United States in particular and the European colonial powers also, that they've had to adjust to. And I'm wondering if there are any unique ways of doing that adjustment that you might have noticed that might be interesting to talk about. I guess that's what I meant. Does that make any sense? Doesn't have to. I've been in the studio a long time today.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what
Yeah.
what you're asking.
What is interesting? You wanted to, something that occurs to you about what's interesting about all this stuff.
Well, another important thing to discuss is just the illegitimacy of the interventions that we're seeing with regards to Venezuela. And I think there has been a lot of discussion about these allies of the United States and the way in which they, from the perspective of their government, have deemed the electoral process in Venezuela to be rigged. That they have already declared, as I said before, the winner to be Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition, of course. But like one of the main organizations that they're doing this through is the Organization of American States. And I was telling Stephen earlier that I don't think that people in general, but certainly not in the Anglo world or in the United States, understand the extent to which the Organization of American States is almost or should be defunct, but it's certainly illegitimate because they have been trying to pass, of course, the OAS led by Luis Almagro, these resolutions on Venezuela since July 31st, when they held an emergency meeting of the Permanent Council on the situation in Venezuela. They drafted a resolution and it actually failed. Even though this is an organization that no longer has Venezuela, Cuba, or Nicaragua as members, within the remainder of the member states that are there, it failed. That's because 11 countries, I think all of which were Caribbean nations, they decided to abstain on the vote, and at least 4, if not 5 countries were actually absent from the session altogether because they said that they didn't want to participate in a meeting of the OAS that was being held about a country that has not been a member of the OAS for the last 5 years. Almost 7.5 years ago, in 2017, Venezuela's representative at the time, I believe, was Delcy Rodriguez, because Delcy Rodriguez, now she's vice president, but at the time she was the foreign minister, announced before the OAS that they would be exiting this organization, and that was completed in 2 years. But they continue to hold meetings. They held a meeting once again last Friday, August 16th, another session that was to be about Venezuela, in which they tried to pass another resolution, but they actually, because of the failure to pass the previous resolution, this time they passed this one by supposed consensus, which means that they didn't have to go to the membership for votes, because once again, for this meeting, 4 states, 4 members decided not to attend. In the case of Mexico, they circulated a statement describing why they didn't two-page statement why they weren't going to attend this meeting, because they said we can't be meeting about a country which has nothing to do with the OAS, and because of course it goes against the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign country. And other countries who did attend the meeting also protested the resolution calling it interventionist, and that included countries of the Caribbean. And another important point, this body, which we know that they were at the forefront of the coup against Evo Morales in October 2019. And of course, for that reason, this electoral mission that they sent talked about all these irregularities in the process, and all of this, of course, culminated in a coup in November of 2019. But presently, because there's so many with so many of the members refusing to participate in the regular meetings, they also have what's called observer states. And there's at least 5 current observer states. Now, every Blackened organization internationally also most have observer states. That's not something, too different from any other situation. But in this situation, not only are they taking votes on a country that is no longer a member of the Organization of American States, but they have people speaking on that issue who were the representatives on Friday of the United Kingdom and of Italy. So they're allowed to take the floor and talk about how important it is to focus on the issue of democracy in Venezuela when those are members who were their observer states that aren't even of Latin America and the Caribbean. They're not states from the Americas. It's really similar to, if you remember all the conversations we had before, how NATO is gathering states that are joining the North Atlantic Organization who are not part of the North Atlantic, so they can sit around their military equipment and build new bases. So that's essentially what they're doing. Luis Almagro and Washington, and Anthony Blinken in this case, have been trying to gather support once again for a new coup, trying to formulate some sort of Lima cartel in order to pressure the Venezuelan government to leave, all sorts of other tactics they're unleashing at the same time. But when they don't have the support they need, they bring in reinforcements from and beyond. Sometimes it's South Korea, sometimes it's Japan.
They got a lot of reinforcements. Money buys some great friends.
And I think that's just another example of the way something that we mentioned earlier remains very much the case. The United States policy isn't going to change. It doesn't matter whether it's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. It doesn't matter. I mean, they're going to maintain these ridiculous presidential decrees that Venezuela and Nicaragua represent a threat to the national security of the United States. They're going to continue upholding those kinds of ridiculous measures. And it'll be interesting to see to what extent the kind of Southern Command fiefdom of the United States armed forces, which perhaps seems to operate its own kind of foreign policy, and that's something that with regard to the outcome of the election, again, I don't think it makes any difference in terms of the incoherence, the institutional incoherence among the different elements of the United States government, and the way whereby you have the United States Treasury will have a policy that may not be in line with the policy of the State Department, for example, and what General Laura Richardson of the Southern Command is doing is she seems to be more active on the diplomatic front in Latin America and the Caribbean than the State Department itself, and she's continually visiting countries like Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, and other countries to try and reinforce bilateral military relations between the armed forces of the United States and the countries that she visits. And so, and that there's a sense in which, although in the United States, the Democratic Convention circus may seem to be important, it's actually, and from the point of view of people in Latin America, it's practically irrelevant because, between the different US institutions, they're going to carry on doing what they've been doing for the last 50 years. And I remember very well the comment by Robert Callahan, who was a very close colleague of John Negroponte, of ill repute across Latin America, Vietnam, and Iraq. And Callahan served with Negroponte in many of those countries. And he, on the night of Barack Obama's successful election, back in whenever it was, 2008, Callahan was asked by a local reporter here, what changes will there be under Barack Obama in US policy towards Latin America? And Callahan replied, US policy towards Latin America has not changed in 50 years. It's unlikely to change under Barack Obama. And he was right.
Yeah. He was right. Hey, I remember when, what was his name? I was going to say Macron. It was 5 years ago, was elected after Christina was turned out. And
Mauricio Macri.
Macri, thank you. I got my Macron and Macris confused, which hideous creature of Washington.
Right.
But they were all those, what the hell, there were some kind of security instruments that secured somewhere, I don't know, about $10 billion worth of assets that had been written off. And he decided, and it was like some not even a hedge fund manager, like a guy who deals with wasted assets.
The vulture funds, Paul Singer.
Yeah, Paul Singer. That's right. Hey, man, Macri couldn't get down there to the bank with him fast enough.
Right. Right, and of course, and that's one of the objects of United States policy, is to use debt as a weapon to subjugate countries without having to send in the military. And Michael Hudson, the really outstanding economist, said that years ago, and I've forgotten in which of his books or in which of his some article, and I think it was in Super Imperialism, where he wrote about how the World Bank and the IMF figured out that they could subjugate a country as effectively via debt as the United States Armed Forces could do by military means, and that's what they've done. That's what they continue to do. That Argentina is hopelessly in debt with the IMF, as is Ecuador, another country that's being where the United States Armed Forces are increasing their presence, and we're likely to see that kind of effect exploited by the United States in the foreseeable future, but in vain. They may try and put a brake on the development of Chinese influence in Latin America and the Caribbean, but they won't stop it.
What's interesting, if you think about it, if the debt, creating and holding debt gives you that kind of power that even can defeat mighty armies, if you compound that by looking at the debt that falls in the aftermath of the construction of these mighty armies, the folks holding that paper got an awful lot of power, both the power intrinsic to the debt and also the power of the assets like military weapons and such that they're able to assemble using it. Because the biggest discretionary expense, of course, of the U.S. government is weapons purchases,
right,
of like $500 billion or more.
Right, and also, and that's, now that you mentioned that, and that is one of the very important elements of Venezuela's defeat of this recent attempt at this recent coup attempt, because Venezuela is completely independent of all that.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why the United States wants to overthrow Nicolas Maduro, because they have no influence over over Venezuela, or Nicaragua's, over Venezuela and Nicaragua's economic policy. And they hate it.
That's true. All right. I think we could maybe stop here. I'm kind of running out of steam. Anybody have anything else they want to make sure gets into the mix here?
No, I'd better get going. I've got animals to feed.
Camilla?
I also have to help with lunch.
Move along. Yeah, okay. Thank you for your time and expertise and your presence, and it was enjoyable as hell as always. And we'll be speaking again. I'm going to be here for another day or two, so if you're around, maybe we can hook up and talk about anything else that pops off while in the interim.
Yeah, I should be around tomorrow if that's any use.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I'll be in touch. I'll be in touch, Camilla. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks a million. Thanks, Don.
Thank you, guys. I'll see you around.
Bye-bye.